Hello, hello, hello. My name is Hannah Awonuga. I'm the founder and CEO of the Inclusive Foundations Program and Illume Executive Consultant. Welcome to Inclusion Re-Engineered. I am so excited to be here again. We are doing this monthly now, and we have had some amazing conversations. So just really quickly, the Inclusive Foundations Program is an organization focused on supporting high growth businesses to build cultures where people thrive and not just survive. And we support organizations at board level and exec level with cultural governance. So that idea of kind of culture, the intersection between culture, inclusion, and governance and systems, inclusive practices, to which the Inclusive Foundations Program is our flagship offering. So today we are talking about something very, very important to my heart. We are still in the month of March, so we are still in Women's Month. And so we are keeping the theme of gender equality, but looking at it through the lens of allyship and sponsorship. Today, I am joined by a good friend of mine and a member of the Inclusive Foundations faculty, Simon Bennett. Simon is an executive coach and a senior charity leader and has spent several years working with senior leaders around well-being, inclusion, but also really thinking about leadership holistically. Simon, welcome.
Really good. Hi, Hannah. Really nice to see you again, and really pleased to be here. Glad we've got a bit of Women's Month left to talk about this important topic.
We have. So the reason for me why this topic is so important is because I have sat in several rooms where there are many women, and we are all talking about the challenges of women and gender equality. And don't get me wrong, I think that there is a space for that. We do need a safe space to be able to talk about some of the challenges that we face, how to navigate kind of workplace politics, how to go for promotions, how to sell yourself, all of them things. But the real change doesn't happen alone. And so to me, I say it all the time, you cannot have a conversation about gender equality without men. You cannot have a conversation about racial equity without white people. For me, that is so critical. And so really having this conversation about the role of allies, the role of sponsors is so critical. So look, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. And actually from a definition perspective, how do you define allyship? How do you define sponsorship? I have my definitions, but I like to talk. So I'll hand it to you. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I mean, I thought a little bit first about actually what does gender equity mean to me, before getting into how allyship and sponsorship might help. And what I settled on was a situation in a workplace where nobody in your organization is held back from their best flourishing. That's the positive side, but also isn't having disproportionately negative experiences because of their gender. And if you're hiring women, but you're maintaining a culture or structures that don't allow them to flourish, and that might be banter. It might be how meetings are conducted. It might be who's getting appointments into senior roles, but also those kind of unofficial conversations where the real power and decisions sit. If that's all still there, then you may be able to claim diversity, and get some numbers up, but you don't have gender equity. And I think you've nailed it in a nice catchy way of workplaces should be a place where people can thrive, not just survive. And I think there are workplaces where women are present, often in numbers, sometimes disproportionately high. That's the case in a lot of the organizations I work with in the charity sector. There's diversity in gender, but there isn't equity.
Yeah. And absolutely. Thank you so much for that, because I do think you really quantifying gender equity is so important, because language evolves so much, and people sometimes think that gender equity just means representation. But actually, to your point, there's so much more to it. And you said a word that gives me shudders: banter. It absolutely drives me crazy, because in a lot of microcultures in organizations, and microcultures are these small cultures that are bred within an organization, either organizations that have outlets, so branches or shop floors, where microcultures are created. Banter versus humor is a real topic to discuss and unpick, because there's a real borderline between what's funny, what's lighthearted, what's a joke, and actually what is at the expense of others. And that's how I quantify banter. Banter is something that is in the expense of others. But let's go back to your definition. So now with that hat on of gender equality, you know, let's unpick that a little bit. What is allyship to you? What is sponsorship to you?
Well, I mean, you know, allyship is definitely not specific just to gender equity. You know, it's about intersectionality of different kinds and demographic groups in general. And crucially, you know, what's people's experience at work? You know, that's what we're getting into with the thriving versus surviving. So allyship in general, I think it's anyone in the privileged group, whatever that may be, you know, and the reality with gender in most places in the world at this point in our history is it's the cisgendered men, you know, who don't have either those missing out on positive or more of the negative experiences, you know, so that's the power group. So all cisgendered men can be allies for gender equity, you know, and that's the great news. You've said before, Hannah, you know, turning up to stuff isn't allyship. You know, so I was asking myself, well, what's the difference between attendance and action in allyship? And you know, I think attendance, it's low risk. You know, it's relatively easy, probably minimal discomfort for yourself, and crucially, you know, I'll be talking about this a lot through our conversation, low impact.
Yes.
So allyship, I think it does start with that attendance, asking questions, you know, turning up to things, speaking to, in this case, you know, people outside that cisgendered male group with curiosity. That can move to solidarity, you know, and that, I think, for me, has associations of, you know, real action or at least planning. But what it really means to me is it's using the perspectives and resources that you have at this time. You may be very senior, you may not be. I remember I said any cisgendered man can be an ally. Using the perspectives and resources that you've got to make female colleagues feel and be safer and more enabled.
Yeah, love that. Definitely going to steal that one.
If you're just talking to women in sympathy, but you're not calling stuff out, or if you're not using power of your more senior to reset accountability structures and culture, you know, banter flourishes because you've got you know, an unsafe culture, then your female colleagues aren't going to be feeling safe and enabled in the way that we talked about at the start there.
Absolutely. Solidarity and presence, attendance, for me, is advocacy. So advocacy is when you, to me, is when you show your support and your curiosity, right? And so you go to the events and you join a network and you try to be an advocate. You try to use your voice for somebody else. Allyship, and actually, do you know what? Over the years, allyship is, you know, the word has been bandied around. We saw it in 2020. We saw it with the Me Too movement. We've seen it with the LGBT community, particularly in June. You know, everyone's an ally. I think allyship for me is where you use your privilege, where you use your position, where you use your power to support another person on their journey. That real intentionality. I love it. I saw it in the chat, you know, lead with intention. That for me is real allyship, because what you're then doing is you're actually then almost trying to move the dial and recognize the privilege that you have whilst doing that. So yeah, thank you so much. And then sponsorship, do you think they're different? I'd love to hear that, your perspective on that.
I think it's a narrower and more formal definition. You know, I think the power and something I'd like people to take away from the conversation is that thing of anyone can be an ally. It's something you can step into and make a decision about now. Sponsorship, I think, you know, you're in a senior leadership position. It's a pairing, or it might be about sponsoring an employee resource group, you know, but it's something about you're specifically in a senior leadership position. There's some defined expectations of you. That might be about pairing with one or more people who are in more junior positions from underrepresented groups and actually facilitating them up through your organization, through introductions and opportunities. It might also be making sure that, you know, if there is a diversity forum around gender, for example, that doesn't just sit over there, you know, populated by people in, you know, your lower paid and middle management roles, you know, and a well-meaning facilitator. There's somebody at the senior level and they've got accountability for taking forward actions that come out from that group. You know, so it's just coming back to this, it's got to be impact and measurable. As an ally, that might be more informal, particularly if you're more junior. As a sponsor or as a senior ally, you should be doing stuff, and people should be able to see what that is and measure it and talk about it and write about it.
Yeah, really love that. I really love that. I agree with you that sponsorship for me does sit at the top. It does sit in the senior positions. And it is that kind of intentionality where, you know, something happens because of you, right? And so whether that be that, you know, you work with someone for 6 months, you work with somebody for 18 months, and then off the back of that relationship, there is an opportunity for them. And that's why when I always talk about mentorship versus sponsorship, because I think mentorship is much more about coaching and supportive and development, whereas sponsorship is about action. And at that senior level, right? I agree with you. And I loved what you just said there about you could be a sponsor of an ERG or inclusion more broadly in your organization. I have seen that. You know, I've seen where senior leaders actively sponsor ERGs or sponsor diversity groups or network, and that has impact, because essentially you can't, as a leader, you can't underestimate the power of your voice, right? You can't underestimate the power of your position. We all know when the CEO writes an email, everyone's ears prick up. So how do you use that to help, you know, and particularly from a gender perspective, you know, how do you use your power as a sponsor to really drive the change? And I suppose for the purpose of the call, it's important for people to know that you also can seek out sponsors. So you could be an individual in your organization. If you find someone who is doing what you want to do in a senior leadership role and you feel quite stuck, you don't feel like you're moving, you can reach out to them, be proactive and reach out to them to really understand kind of, you know, what they do, but also how you can enter into some type of mentorship or sponsorship relationship. But yeah, thank you for that. I think that was really helpful to just really bring that to life around, you know, especially that difference between allyship and sponsorship.
I think that large clarification you made is really important. You know, I wouldn't want people to walk away thinking, oh, because sponsorship is often more formalized, that's the only way. As you say, take the initiative.
Yeah,
you know, reach out, you know.
Yeah. So look, Simon, so you work with senior leaders every day. And so for me, I would love to hear, you know, your thoughts on kind of what happens in that process. Because, you know, when you look at the teams, they, you know, and we look at who's getting promoted, who's getting supported, who is getting sponsored, we're still seeing a disparity from a gender perspective. And then, you know, I'm always going to take it one layer further, which is if you even then add race to that, there is the kind of compounding impact of that. So, you know, what do you think is stopping, you know, leaders, allies, sponsors? What's happening across? So they're doing all the advocacy stuff, they're going to the events, but what's stopping them from actually creating opportunity and space?
I mean, I think there's two areas, and I think, and one is personal, and I want to park that for later in the call, and the other is structural. And I think, you know, even if you are very senior, this is not a one-person project. You know, you need to look at your organization as a system, if, you know, as a system of systems interacting with each other, and really unpick where in that is the barriers. And you know, I want to pick an example that I was made aware of recently. It's just to illustrate. So somebody I hold in you know, very high esteem, and somebody who's was the network coordinator for an EDI forum in their organization. This is a big tech firm. On paper, things look good, you know, policies and procedures, a lot of forums, etc. And that person had to step down from the network coordinator role because of burnout.
Okay.
And I think it's quite a common setup in organizations. You know, there are these, whether it's forums, whether it's a sponsorship arrangement, that's there on paper, but the key ingredient is time. If people are not being given the time to take up these roles, then very few people will, and those that do take them up will probably end up burning out and having to drop them. You know, so it's the organization saying, yeah, we're actually going to take away some of the things that your job consists of. You know, that might be, you know, and that's a hard thing for organizations to decide on. You know, that P&L responsibility, you know, headcount, you need to reduce some drain on that person's time to meaningfully allow them to take up you know, the role as a senior sponsor, the role as a network coordinator. You know, the good news for organizations is that will pay you back. if you invest that time in having meaningful organizational infrastructure that frees up time for people to take up these roles, what you're going to get back is you're going to attract diverse people. They're going to be meaningfully included. And so you're going to have genuinely equitable teams along gender lines and along other, demographic and intersectional lines as well. What that's going to give you is creativity, productivity, wellness, and people who are engaged and are willing to go the extra mile. You're doing the other, where you've got the intention, you've got the paperwork, but you haven't built that infrastructure and time for people. And unfortunately, it's going to peter out, and what you're going to see then is staff turnover, absence, suboptimal engagement, and these are things that really cost businesses. And turnover is the one that concerns me, I think, the most, because when people are leaving, they're leaving to more competitors.
I think you make such a great point, and I feel I see it in twofold, and I love the angle you're taking it, which is if you don't create the inclusive environment for people to thrive, they will leave, or they'll be disengaged, or they will be burnt out, right? There is that. And I think, you're right. How do you just make sure that as an organization, you're creating a culture where people feel safe, but they also feel like they have the room to breathe, to grow, to progress? I do, though, think that leadership has such an important role to play in who gets promoted. So, a lot of the managers are, they are part of a system that either does internal promotions, that has a payroll cycle that comes once a year. And so they are the ones who determine, who is getting promoted, who is getting bonuses, who is getting pay rises. And so I suppose my thought process around the question is, what in them systems is stopping women from progressing? Now, from my perspective, I think it is so deep rooted. It starts way before your performance review. It starts in who gets the stretch projects. It starts with who, is assigned to the work that is recognized, who is getting visibility. I always tell this story about when I was wanting to get promoted to director at Barclays. I remember going to my boss and I was just like, right, I want to be promoted. And he said, nobody in HR Exco knows you. And he was giving me, insight, because what he was saying is that if you want to be promoted, your visibility is really important. Are we doing that enough? Do we have senior leaders? Do we have senior allies? Do we have senior sponsors who is giving us that intel? Or is that still protected for the golf course, the Friday drinks, the closed kind of groups?
And that's why that infrastructure is important, because what you described there is there was an element of luck. You spoke to somebody who was able and willing to facilitate that and say, this is what you want to do. I don't know how much they've been supportive with that. At least they gave you the sort of insight. Different person, different day, you wouldn't have had that, and that's not acceptable. That there's so much that relies on who's the individual person, what's their specific attitude, and for organizations to bite the bullet around, who are you recruiting into senior positions, and what are the expectations on them? What does their role description and what does their own performance review criteria and actions say around what are they doing around sponsorship and allyship and advancing gender equity? And then the last thing, of course, is accountability. So if that's all there, but it's not then being looked at through the year, not just parked in a box and looked at a year later, oh, well, maybe next year, if that's being looked at through the year by their seniors, and accountability, and remedial steps being taken if the person isn't fulfilling that part of their role, using their power and position to address issues around underrepresented recruitment, address inaccessibility to where the real conversations are taking place. If they're on the golf course, then either everyone needs to come to the golf course or you need to move it somewhere else. One of the two. It's a lovely way of thinking about it. It's a little bit of a funny one, but it's a lovely way of thinking about it. You've got to pick one of the two. Otherwise, you've got a structural but unspoken, that's the key thing. The golf course isn't mentioned in the role description or the performance review, but it's such a real barrier, that you've got to name it and then you've got to address it, either by taking everyone to the golf course or by moving those conversations somewhere else.
I love that. Because I always say there is nothing wrong with the golf course. There's nothing wrong with creating moments for intimate conversations and really getting to understand, because actually when you move into senior positions, it isn't just about getting your job done, it's about your relationships, it's about the connections that you have. And so it's not about, no one should go to the golf course. It's about how inclusive are them environments, so that everyone, to your point, let's all go, or let's create other pockets that, you know, women, ethnically diverse people, people from neurodiverse conditions can also have an equal opportunity to get in front of leaders. There was something you said that I really wanted to touch on, which is there's also a real element in the work that we do at IFP, which is around cultural governance, because who is being held accountable? And so the way we see cultural governance is the intersection between governance. So your board governance, which is you meet quarterly, you read the papers, you understand the business, you understand the direction of the business, the financials, the business strategy, the client acquisition, and adding culture into that governance. There is a governance already existing. And so if we take this idea of why are women not being progressed, that is a conversation for the board. The board should take as much interest as they do business acquisition, as they do profitability, with who is getting on in this business. And so that's why our core thesis is, how do we drive cultural governance across the organization through inclusive practices and board engagement. But yeah, I really love that point of, it's not about the golf course isn't bad, it's just that it's not accessible to everyone. And so, you know, to your point, how do we create more pockets of that for that type of interaction and growth?
And not leave it to chance. It can't be that, a key person leaves who was driving this and now it all falls apart. That's building it into the structure, as you say, cultural governance. And thank you for that, because you're right. You know, again, if you are likable, then actually what happens is that if you are likable, you get ahead. If you can talk well, if you present well, if you hold yourself well, then you can almost create them opportunities. But that isn't equitable, because if you are a little bit quieter, if you are an introvert, if you just want to get your head down, you should still be able to succeed and still have them opportunities to grow. And I know we're talking about allyship and sponsorship from a male perspective, but you know, Raj says the queen bee syndrome is real. It is real. So you know, that's also thinking about, how do women create space for other women as well? And you know, I have a different view on this, and I don't want to diverge the conversation, but there's an element of me that recognizes that when you get to them senior positions, you are holding on for dear life. As a woman, as a Black senior woman, as a partner in an organization, as a senior leader, when you get to them senior positions, there is an element of you're holding on to your job, because now you are the only woman or the only Black person in the room. But I think what we need to get better at is creating more opportunities and more spaces, so that we don't feel like we're the only one, so we don't feel like we're holding on to our seats, in order for us to be able to give back, send the ladder down, you know, whatever we want to call it. But I think them two distinctions are important. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, something like queen bee syndrome, like it's a helpful label in a way, but it does park that very much with the individual. And I think, you know, that's unfair, you know, because I would be saying, okay, well, what's making the person feel like that? Why don't the person feel safe enough to leave the ladder down, you know? And what unfortunately, you know, you do see quite a lot of is women of color. Often, you know, we're not just talking about gender, but it is unfortunately what we see in some statistics: women of color being promoted into very senior positions in organizations, and then about 18 months or 2 years later being forced out. And what's happened is that the organization's problems have been concentrated with that person. They've been labeled then as a failure. And then you think, well, of course, women, and particularly women of color, are going to feel a queen bee syndrome unsafety in those top levels, because unfortunately the world of work is littered with evidence that you are at more risk. That's not a person being nasty or problematic. That's a structural issue that cultural governance needs to solve.
I love that. Thank you for taking it away from the individual, because you're right, you know, and it's not nice when you're on the receiving end of a queen bee. It is not a nice feeling, because you're like, wait, we're women, you know, women to women. But I appreciate you taking it up a level and asking deeper questions, which is, well, why is that? Why is that happening? Why does one person feel like they can't send the ladder down? And usually it's because they are the only woman in them rooms, and so therefore they are fending for themselves, as well as their work, as well as how their tone, as well as how they present themselves, and but then I don't want to take it away from some women just don't want to help other women. That is a reality. But men have that same thing, ethnically diverse people have that same thing as well. So yeah, really, really good point. Now let's move it on a little bit and stick to the topic of allyship, because I wanted to talk to you about a framework that I created in 2022 called the 3 Ps to allyship: power, privilege, and position. And the reason why I created this framework is because I was seeing several leaders call themselves allies and just attending International Women's Day events. And at first it was great, and I was just like, wow, it's so good to see men like coming into the conversation, leaning into the conversation. But the numbers was not, the numbers wasn't correlating to the number of men attending events. So what was happening is, yeah, it was great that they were attending events, but the data wasn't showing that actually that was having an intrinsic impact on representation, promotion, senior leadership kind of, representation. There wasn't a correlation. So I wanted to bring a framework to life that really shows how to be an effective ally. And to me, that is power, using your power, using your privilege, and using your position. Because you do have power. You can open doors. You can make the phone call, right? Using your privilege. Your privilege is that you hold a budget. Your privilege is that you are privy to rooms that others are not. And your position is that you might be an MD of a firm. You might be a director. You might be a vice president. You might be a senior leader or a team leader. That position holds weight. How do you use that position? If you have a board meeting every quarter, why don't you take somebody into your board meeting the next time you go in? You have that. You have the position, you have the position, privilege, you have the power to do that. They can sit and they observe. One thing I loved about when I worked in financial services is that they had this idea of ex officio, which is where they would put somebody, they did it for women, they did it for ethnically diverse people, on the board for a period of time to give them board exposure, board visibility. They gave them work. They asked them to present at board. That is using power, privilege, and position. So I suppose my question to you, Simon, is, how do you relate to that? Does that resonate with you? Have you used it in your leadership? Are there any challenges to doing that?
Well, I mean, I said earlier, there's the structural challenges for senior leaders, and I think there is also the personal. And I really want people who are listening, who are in those positions of power, or who work with the people in those positions of power who are listening today, to take away actionable things that they can do. And we've talked about, cultural governance as a way of addressing some of the structural problems. Some of the problems are, within individual people. What's my advice, or what would be the first move? The first move is be kind to yourself. Sticking your neck out is hard, and it's okay if it feels hard. And in fact, I think if you're taking allyship, the sponsorship actions as a senior leader, and it's feeling hard, it's probably an indicator that you're doing it right.
Yeah.
If you're sort of in tune with, on reflection, I've just witnessed a microaggression in a meeting, and I've left that meeting without saying something, and you're feeling ashamed, but you're committing to doing something differently next time. That's commendable, rather than brushing it under the carpet. Humans don't like change. It's a fundamental, developmental driver in us that we need to see stability around us. Modern workplaces, the only constant is change. So people are already unsettled on a psychological level. So when you're asking for fundamental changes to be made around power structures, relationships to authority, and no, that's not how we do it around here, but nobody says that. Actually, it's unspoken. Being the person who says that and says, we're actually going to do something about it, and we're going to look at it again in 3 months at the most senior level to see if we've shifted, is difficult. So if you're struggling, to take forward steps as an ally or as a sponsor, keep going, because that's telling me that you're pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, I really love that. And what you're talking about is courage. And I never used to like the word courage in the workplace, because it's almost like you're asking people to build the courage. And actually, you shouldn't have to feel courageous at work. The environment, the culture should allow you to feel like you can speak up without fear. Courage, you're building, when people ask you to be courageous, they're asking you to do something that may have some type of retaliation or backlash. So I don't like to use the word courage, but I do think it's important in what you're saying. Because as an ally, as a sponsor, there may be times where you have to step out and do something that goes against the grain. I've shared it with all the faculty, but I love that video of the man dancing in the field. It's a YouTube video, and he's dancing really crazy, and alone he looks like a lone ranger. He looks like a crazy person on his own, but because he did it, others started to follow him, and then it became that everyone in the park was dancing. And so I often see leadership in that vein. Sometimes you have to step out and do something differently, and it might feel uncomfortable because no one else is doing it, but that's usually the catalyst for everyone to move into that direction. And so I completely, because even for me, I've been on a journey with inclusion myself. There are things I've had to unlearn, and as part of my unlearning journey, I've had to step out and do something that feels different, feels difficult. So look, I'm conscious of time. There's one thing I wanted to touch on, which is the fear of saying the wrong thing, similar to what we've just talked about around stepping out and doing things that might feel courageous. But I'd love to hear your perspective on, there are a lot of white men that I speak to, and I'm loving speaking to CEOs at the moment. Like, I thought I was a bit nervous at first. I thought, like, I'm used to just being one of, many in an organization. But now as a founder, I'm having conversations with CEOs, and it's so great to hear their intention, but there is also a deep fear. There is a deep fear. There's a fear of getting it wrong. There's a fear of saying the wrong thing. There's a fear of, the unintended consequences of inclusion. Oh, you exclude another group. So we'll use this as our last question, which I feel like, oh my God, we could have just been talking for ages. Like, I love these sessions, and Simon, you've been a brilliant. The last question I have for you is around, what would you say to senior white men? And, I can see we have a really diverse group as well. So Black men and men in general, I would say, who might be worried about saying the wrong thing when it comes to gender equality, gender equity.
First thing I'd say, I mean, as you know, it's my mantra is, be kind to yourself. The second thing I would say is thank you for worrying. You're clearly or starting to look into the dark places in your organization and in how that interacts with your own personality and history. And the fact that you're looking there is commendable. Stick with it. What I'd say next is you don't have to do this by yourself. That's what the Inclusion Foundations program is here for. And even just reaching out to other people in your organization, you may already have, the person who runs your gender ERG may be many ranks below you, but you've got a resource there. I guarantee you that person will be delighted if you come and speak to them about, I'm really struggling, with worrying about how to take this forward without causing different problems in another area. That person will take you up on that conversation. You can plan together, and you can grow a group who's going to find the solutions. But, the fact that you're worrying, makes me think you're the right kind of person to be thinking about this, because you're not taking a bull in a china shop approach. You're not taking a tick box approach. You're not just going with whichever month it happens to be, or whichever, group happens to be in front of you at the moment. But you're actually thinking about the interdependencies and intersectionality and how to take forward something that is going to be equitable for everybody. It shows you're along the right lines, and if you need our help with it, then please reach out. These are the kind of conversations that we love having, and fortunately bring the kind of experience that means that you're not going to have to reinvent the wheel, and we can walk through this difficult path together.
Absolutely, particularly now, right, where we've got this highly politicized environment. And, people often ask me, well, why are you setting up a D&I D&I practice because the Trump administration, DEI is dead. And I said, well, essentially, we focus on cultural governance. There is an element of inclusion there, but really it's about organizational culture. there is an element of how do you make sure that some of this stuff is systemized, so it takes the burden off of one individual.
Exactly.
Sometimes I speak to CEOs and they have it on their backs. Now, don't get me wrong, you're the CEO, you're paid a lot of money, so it should be, but it shouldn't. It's not one individual's job to solve. Actually,
you're in charge, but it's not all on you. They're different things.
Exactly that. And actually, you know, use your power, your privilege, and your position to help create the systems that will become more equitable, right? And then the point about saying the wrong thing, do the work, read the books, listen to the podcast, watch the movies. Like, there's so much resources out there. I just don't let leaders get off with, I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. I understand it, but in today's day and age, you could quietly speak to ChatGPT about how to speak to people more inclusively. You could quietly do the reading. You could, you know, you could wait till the end of the year and buy my book, The Illusion of Inclusion. See the little plug. But there's so much resources. And then to your point, Simon, which is greatly appreciated, come and talk to us. You know, that's what we do. We speak to boards, we speak to senior leaders, we speak to CEOs, we work with HR teams, we work with ERG leaders to really drive this work, because it is not dead. It is far from it. You know, we might call it something different, we might approach it in a different way, but essentially the work still remains the same. And so
my experience is it's only accelerating. You know, working in this country is only accelerating.
Yeah.
Because there's so much research about the benefits. You know, this is evidence-based. We're not just, you know, well-meaning people.
Exactly.
You know, this is good business sense.
Yeah. And I love that. Yeah, that last point. The Workers' Protection Act just come in. All inclusion. That is inclusion.
Yeah, it's only going that way in this country. Up.
Yeah, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap, the fact that you now have to publish action plans of your gender pay gap, all things that indicate that inclusion isn't going anywhere. But look, Simon, thank you so much. I think we'll be talking for ages, you know. So I'm really grateful to have you on the faculty, really grateful for this conversation. And thank you to everyone who's joined, everyone in the comments as well.
Thank you,
we really appreciate you. We're here every month talking about something different. I'm excited to get into another topic next month. And yeah, if any of this resonates, if you want to talk to us more about any of this, then please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.